Hi, welcome everyone to Iowa Ideas. My name is Aaron Murphy, and I am the Des Moines Bureau Chief for the Gazette. This session is called Innovating When Restricted by Policy, and we're coming to you from the conference's Human and Social Services track. Some of the questions we'll be trying to answer today as policies shift or government programs expire. Some nonprofits must scramble to find ways to continue to provide the offerings that are critical to their clients. What happens when the government pulls back on high demand social services and nonprofits are forced to pick up the slack? How far can nonprofits flex and still be sustainable? We'll talk about all that and more. Before we jump into things and introduce our expert panel here, just a couple of quick housekeeping reminders to share. One, these sessions are being recorded and closed captioning access is available. And also, for all of you tuning in, you can submit questions through the Q&A function in the chat. So if you have a question that pops up that we haven't gotten to here in our discussion, you'd be curious to hear from our panel, please submit that in the chat, and those will get fed to me, and we'll tackle those as time allows. And also, we want to thank Tanager, who is our sponsor for all the sessions in the Human and Social Services track. So we appreciate their support in helping us to put on this event. All right, now that that's taken care of, let's meet our fantastic panel here, and I'll go around the horn here and do a really quick introduction, and then I'll bring it back to them all to tell us a little bit more about themselves. So we have, pardon me, we have with us Max, and forgive me, Max, I forgot to ask the pronunciation before we went on the air. Pronounce your last name for me, Max.
Max Mowitz, like when you mow the lawn.
There we go. One little bit of housekeeping I forgot to do, so you got it live. Max Mowitz is executive director for One Iowa, which seeks to improve the lives of LGBTQ Iowans by protecting and advancing equality and inclusiveness through education, improving workplace culture, and increasing access to quality healthcare across our state. We also have with us Bethany Snyder, who is director of the Iowa Nonprofit Alliance, which is a membership organization dedicated to advocating for and supporting Iowa's nonprofit sector. And we also have Emily Blum, who is Chief Executive Officer of Foundation to Crisis Services, which performs life-saving work in crisis prevention, intervention, and response. So thank you all for being here to join us for this conversation. All right, now that I've introduced you all to our outstanding panel, let's learn a little bit more about each one of them and why they're here as part of this discussion. Again, we'll go around the horn. I'll invite each of you to tell us more about yourself, about your organization, and how that organization's work is relevant to our discussion. And Emily, let's have you kick us off.
Sure. Good morning. Thanks, Aaron. Yes, so I am the CEO at Foundation to Crisis Services. We are headquartered in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. We have approximately 200 employees, and we provide services mostly related to crisis, mental health and crisis intervention across the state of Iowa. We do that through the contract with Your Life Iowa. We're one of the 2988 providers in the state of Iowa. We also have in-person crisis response services. We have an emergency shelter for runaway homeless and human trafficked youth. So there are a couple ways that this topic impacts us. One of them is that we have a lot of contracts that are held by government entities, county, state, federal government, and with those comes a variety of expectations that often can change from year to year, along with funding requiring us to pivot and make changes, which I'll talk a little bit about later. I think the other thing that's important is that often policy impacts people and quality of life, and that is the commodity that we work in. So our services are there to support the community, and often policy directly impacts the people we serve. And so that's just kind of another piece of this. But happy to be here.
All right, very good. Bethany, tell us a little bit about yourself and your organization. Hope it. Yeah, we got technical difficulties. Bethany, you're muted there. We'll come back to you while we get that figured out. So, Max, there we go. There's Bethany.
Thank you. Sorry about that. So hi, I'm Bethany Snyder, and as Aaron mentioned, I'm the director of the Iowa Nonprofit Alliance, and we represent Iowa's 25,000 nonprofits. And as you can imagine, nonprofits and policy are intricately combined. Sometimes we're even referred to as the third sector, the public, private, and then the nonprofit sector. Um, we work with nonprofits on a couple of things. We work to make sure that our nonprofits know how to advocate and can advocate for themselves and their sector and their industry and their clients and the people they serve. But then we also make sure that lawmakers understand that when they make policy decisions, it impacts the nonprofits. It impacts nonprofits in their community. So I'm excited to talk more about that today.
Excellent. Thank you, Bethany. And Max, tell us a little about yourself in One Iowa.
Yeah. Well, thanks so much for having me today. Howdy, my name is Max Mowitz. As was mentioned, I am the new executive director of One Iowa, and I use they and he pronouns. I, of course, have come into the role of executive director within the last couple months, but I actually served as the program director for the organization for over 5.5 years. And we focus in a lot of different areas in LGBTQ advocacy, but we do work statewide. Some of the different areas that we focus on primarily are healthcare access, making sure that LGBTQ people have access to safe and affirming healthcare throughout our state. Workplace culture, of course, making sure that the places that people work are LGBTQ affirming and supportive. We also have an LGBTQ Leadership Institute. We know that developing LGBTQ leaders throughout our state is really vital as well. And we do advocacy work with our 501c4 organization, One Iowa Action, which is really at the forefront of fighting anti-LGBTQ legislation, some of which we'll talk more about today. But of course, this topic is relevant to me and our work because LGBTQ liberation work has shifted pretty considerably over the past several years with the onslaught of the anti-LGBTQ bills in Iowa. And we know that a lot of these bills were just copy and pasted from other states. And I think that that's important to mention because while we know that this harmful legislation isn't constituent-led, we know that it also still has an impact on our community. And the way that that impact has been realized is that what we're seeing is that a lot of the organizations that we typically work with and the funding we typically get is being pulled from our work because our communities are becoming really risk averse when it comes to working with LGBTQ people. So they're pulling dollars and grants and sometimes even attempting to censor what we say and what we do. And so when I'm looking at a panel like this and what I am hoping to add, I am going to be able to talk about how these like larger nationwide shifts have impacted us and the work that we do and how we're pivoting to manage that too.
All right, very good. And that leads me perfectly into as a kind of sort of second part of the introductory phase here. Get at our topic and hear from each of you if you have an example of a time when a shift in a government program, either via policy or funding, forced your organization to adapt. And Max, we'll start with you because as you just alluded to, obviously there's been a lot going on the past few years on the state lawmaking front that has an impact on LGBTQ Iowans. So let's start with you on this one. Kind of describe the way your organization has been forced to either change or adapt or address what's happened at the state level.
Of course, as I just mentioned, we'd seen this pretty intense shift in support specifically from our state and national government. Of course, with a lot of the people that we work with, they're becoming a little bit more concerned about working with LGBTQ people overall. So a good example of this is the youth gender affirming care ban that was enacted in 2023 has caused a lot of healthcare organizations to start to be worried and do risk management around providing gender affirming care for all LGBTQ people, for example. We also see legislation like this impact the amount of like baseline knowledge that people have. So people don't know that some services are still available in Iowa or still legal in Iowa because there's a lot of misinformation. So there's kind of all of that. But one of the ways that we're trying to adapt to this is to prepare for grant funding and programs to dissolve. We are trying to stay ahead of that and to be pragmatic about the fact that a lot of the grants that have supported us and our community partners in the past may not exist or may not continue to fund LGBTQ specific projects simply because LGBTQ is labeled on the project itself. Of course, this impacts us at One Iowa, but also impacts so many of our statewide partners that work with youth, that work in specifically in the healthcare setting only, like all of these other resources that we'll often refer to or use to support the folks that we, provide support to. We know that we're not the only people that are going to be impacted, of course, which is what this is addressing as well. But instead of feeling secure about the grants and projects that we have, we know that it's pretty likely that a fruitful, like meaningful grant could be defunded just because, again, it's LGBTQ specific. And so as a result, I am just trying to think about which roles would need to be redesigned to manage that, especially because we don't want to lose staff in the process of losing this funding. We know that our work is still vital, regardless of if there's a government program or grant that's willing to fund it. So I'm trying to think strategically about what comes next in the next 1, 3, and 5 years as we see these programs dissolve.
Yeah, and forgive me for lingering too long here. I want to get to Emily and Bethany too, but I'm just curious, Max. So does that mean, do you have to start thinking about other revenue streams too? Do you have to lean more on donors? What's that kind of impact there?
Yeah, this is a great follow-up. So I do think that one of the things we're also seeing in the same way that we see this with our statewide and national funders, we also see corporate dollars shifting away from LGBTQ support because they are also worried about having their name be associated with an LGBTQ organization, specifically one like ours that does advocacy work and talks about these hard issues. While we know that dollars should go to every LGBTQ advocacy organization, it's a lot harder for folks to fund an organization like ours that's willing to talk about the hard things and how it's harming our community and to do that courageously. So that's something that we're seeing. But I will say that when it comes to the strategy to, compensate for that, I do think that trying to work with individual donors to support our work has been really helpful because often when we see this anti-LGBTQ hostility, the thing that we see an uptake in is individuals that want to donate to our work because they believe in the work that we do, even in the hard times, and especially in the hard times. They see the value of our work when things are on fire. And so one of the goals that I have is to focus a little bit more on supporting those individual donors and making sure that they feel engaged in our work, and also working with our corporate and our public funders to have them better understand how to support our work in ways that feel doable for them and meeting them where they're at as well. So I think there's a bit of a shift in strategy that has to happen, and I'm looking to be really creative about that too. And I hope to learn from the other folks on the too.
Yeah, interesting. Bethany, this is maybe a little bit different for you because you represent, a coalition of nonprofits, not necessarily one specifically, but do you have, did you come up with any examples of when a policy or a funding shift is forced a nonprofit to make adjustments?
Sure. I mean, there are hundreds and countless of examples, but I'll give you one that has impacted our sector, sector-wide. And this is really under the category of when lawmakers don't think about the nonprofit sector. I would put that in. I just want to remind folks that the nonprofit sector in Iowa is the second largest workforce in Iowa. 1 in 11 Iowans works in the nonprofit sector. So when the nonprofit sector is forgotten, it's not small, it's not insignificant. It impacts 1 in 11 workers in Iowa. So one good example is during COVID, the Reynolds administration created a business recovery fund to help keep businesses afloat. Great, wonderful. We need that. They forgot to include a way for nonprofits to apply for that funding. You had to provide your business tax ID number or something. I don't know. I don't do for-profit stuff, so I don't know what it's called. And so there was no way for nonprofits to apply for this funding. And like I just mentioned, 1 in 11 Iowans works at a nonprofit. And so luckily, a group of our leaders got together and went up and said, hey, there needs to be a way for nonprofits to, and to apply for this funding. Second, during COVID, nonprofits were like frontline workers during COVID. So that made it even more critical for these nonprofits to stay afloat. And so I think that's one great example of what happens when our lawmakers forget about how important the nonprofit sector is to our economy and our communities.
Yeah, that's interesting, and forgive me for picking up on one specific thing there, but I'm curious. That's a pretty interesting number. 1 in 11 Iowans work for a nonprofit, and I'm just curious if that. So, like for example, one of the things I do when I'm not the Gazette's deputy bureau chief is I volunteer at a local children's theater, which is a nonprofit organization. Would that loop me into that? Am I one of those 11 by that extension, or are you talking about something?
We're talking about paid employees.
Okay, okay.
Yes.
So that's
that
even
is not,
more impressive then.
Yes, that exactly does not include volunteers. But
Yeah.
interestingly enough, Iowa is number fourth in volunteerism in the nonprofit sector, and they contribute billions of dollars of unpaid labor to keep our nonprofits afloat. So the volunteers are also a critical piece of the puzzle as well.
Yeah, very good. Interesting. Super. Okay, Emily, same question to you.
Sure. So most recently, I would say that policy and practice changes around the 988 Suicide and Crisis Lifeline have really impacted our agency in both positive and challenging ways. So we have been part of the national network since the inception of the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline in 2005. But in July of 2022, the FCC voted to have that 10-digit number transition to a 3-digit number, 988. It's a federal mandate. It was interesting because one administration approved it, a different administration began moving it forward, and then states were responsible for actual implementation of the 988 crisis suicide and crisis lifeline. So this came with really specific expectations, including data points. We have to answer 90% of calls in 20 seconds or less. There's specific documentation requirements. There's specific policies we have to have. And quite honestly, a giant increase in call volume, which required our agency to pivot really rapidly. One of the ways we had to do that is workforce. There are specific qualifications in Iowa code that require education and experience levels. So finding people with those right levels that are a good match with Iowa code, who can also tolerate the difficulty of the work, is an ongoing challenge. We know that turnover continues to be a huge issue. We're also just kind of as a kind of byproduct of this, we're also at a point where, we need so many staff. We're somewhat oversaturating the area where our agency is headquartered. And so as we look at remote staff, we run into issues with benefits. We're looking at out-of-state employees who can do this work remotely, but how does that really impact them? Like one of the challenges right now is health insurance. Do the health insurance plans we offer really support in network if someone lives out of state? And then just to throw a little bit more into it, the FCC just implemented geo-routing, which has also increased volume and also increases and improves collaborative care.
Can you, sorry to interrupt, Emily,
Yeah.
for those who aren't experts in the field, can you explain what geo-routing is?
Yeah, absolutely. So geo-routing, geolocation would be that you would know exactly where I was at, which is not what we're talking about. We're talking about geo-routing, which is that the cell phone tower that is closest to where you physically are sends the call to the closest crisis center in the state. And so that allows people in Iowa who physically are in this space, even if they have a phone number with a different area code, to be routed to a Iowa center. So prior to this, if I had a 303 area code because I was from Colorado and I called 988, I would go to a Colorado center. They can still provide services and supports, but we really think Iowans should be served by Iowans who really know the resources and understand some of this policy and access to services and those types of things. So geo-routing has really allowed us to improve that care, but it also has increased volume. And again, just when you have policy in place that has very specific metrics that we have to meet, but then workforce becomes an issue, and that all kind of came at once. It required us to do a lot of really creative planning for recruitment, retention, and so trying to navigate all of that with the expansion of the Suicide and Crisis Lifeline has posed many challenges.
Yeah, and you touched on some workforce a little bit in there. I want to get to that in a little bit here. I'm curious, really quick, Emily. You mentioned the way 988 was implemented, and it started with one administration,
Yeah.
another one kind of implemented, and then it gets punted to the states to finish the
Yeah.
job. That's a lot of chefs in the kitchen. Was there any challenge? I'm curious.
Yeah,
Was there any
there's
challenges?
lots of challenges with that. So when you look at, so under President Trump is when the FCC actually made the decision to transition to a 3-digit number, but then under President Biden is when that actually kind of rolled out. And in there's SAMHSA, this Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration with the government actually oversees it, but there's a subcontractor that actually oversees the contracts, which also complicated things. And then again, this is a federal mandate that states had to implement. And so, Iowa has been really supportive of our organization as we've gone through this. But I think there's challenges for them as they try to navigate what's expected on a federal level for states to implement. It's never fun to implement something that someone else decided. I mean, that's stuff that we do that even, that we struggle with. But it's such a critical service. And so, Iowa has done a much better job implementing those changes than many of the other states that we work with on the national level.
Very good. All right, that gives us some great background. I just want to remind folks who maybe joined us a minute or two in. First of all, thank you for being here. And if you have any questions for our panel, please enter them in the chat as we go through things. And if you're not hearing a question you'd be curious to hear from any of our members or all of them, put that in the chat. That'll get fed to me, and we'll get to those throughout our discussion here. Okay, before we get again too granular here, I'd be curious to hear your perspectives on this, and we sort of have started to touch on this a little bit in some of the comments. When the government, and whether that's an agency or through lawmaking, when the government goes through the process of making either funding or policy changes, like you have all now described, I'm curious to get your experience with engagement. Are you consulted at all on those changes? Do you feel like your input is sought and valued? And Bethany, since you did touch on this a little bit, we'll start with you here. And this could be, it could be state government, federal government, however you'd like to share. But in your experience, are policymakers good at engaging the nonprofit sector?
I would say, so with different sectors, it has different experiences, right? I know Max is going to speak to some of the challenges with LGBTQ community and obviously with behavioral health. But as a sector, I would say I would give them a C minus. I don't know if I was going to rate them. Some states, we can look to other states for some best practices in this area. Some states are required, if there's any kind of advisory committee or if there's any kind of legislation that impacts a certain sector, to have a stakeholder group, and they must have so many, representatives from nonprofits or from the community or from people impacted. So some states have requirements like that kind of build that in. So there's a lot of things the Iowa Nonprofit Alliance is hoping to do to think about how do we better further that relationship between nonprofits and the government. Another idea that we have seen in other states is a nonprofit liaison. This could be an IDEA or just part of someone's job, and their job is to be thinking. I say that right now, there's no one in state government that wakes up thinking about Iowa's nonprofits every day. No one. There's someone who's thinking about Iowa's businesses. There's someone who's thinking about Iowa's hospitals. There's someone who's thinking about Iowa's, nursing homes. But there's no one's thinking about Iowa's nonprofit and how healthy our sector is. And so that is one of the things that we are hoping to do as an alliance is to, again, strengthen that relationship between government and nonprofits so they don't forget that, and they say this all the time, just because you cut off funding for housing or food or medical services doesn't mean people are magically fed or housed or have medical services. What it does is it just puts more pressure on the nonprofit sector to provide those services. And we've seen this over the last 20, 30 years. Things that the government traditionally has been responsible for, now the nonprofit sector is responsible for without funding. So that's one of the things we're really hoping to do over the next few years is, again, strengthen that relationship. So when lawmakers are making those decisions, they think, oh, who do I need to get input from?
Very good. Emily, what's been your experience at Foundation 2?
Yeah, so as an expert in crisis response and suicide prevention in the state, we often have ongoing discussions with the state about best practice, implementation of programs, gaps, needs, growth, changes on the landscape, and often the state works to come up with kind of those advisory committees similar to what Bethany said. Like the behavioral health redesign, I was on the advisory committee for that. It was kind of a cross-sector across the state, variety of different service providers and different entities, kind of at the beginning to kind of figure out, okay, who has a stake in this? What does it look like? I also think we're part of, and a lot of nonprofits are part of specific associations. So similar to like Bethany and her organization, like we're members of the Iowa Behavioral Health Association. And so sometimes those associations can act as a liaison for specific initiatives or specific topics. I often feel that our opinion or feedback is valued by government entities, but there are times, just like with any power differential, where there might already be a plan in place, and our feedback, while it's asked for, might have little impact on the outcome or implementation. But as a leader, I'm pretty candid. I often share my opinion without even being asked. And I think that one of the challenges is that we live and breathe the work that we do. And there are times where policy seems good in concept, but the logistics really pose issues that policymakers can't see. And it's these times where I really want and often wish that we had opportunities to share feedback and have that feedback really valued as part of the decision-making process. So Bethany gives them a C. I would probably, in our specific line of work with the relationships we have with the state, I would probably give them a B. But I think that, there's so much going on that it can be really hit or miss on, did a policymaker, did, a community, a state, a federal government, did they get the right people in the room to be able to make sure that they haven't missed anything? And I think that can be really hard to do, especially with really complicated problems that people are trying to solve.
Yeah. All right. Max, to you this one. So I know that reference to some of the laws that you have talked about already here, those were obviously enacted by the majority Republican Party at the state house. I am curious that clearly those all went in the opposite direction of what you would have like to have seen, to put it mildly. But I am curious, was One Iowa at least engaged in that process?
Yeah, it's interesting. I don't know that I could accurately give a good grade here. I think that there's a few things to keep in mind. The first is when we look at anti-LGBTQ legislation, as I mentioned earlier, it is largely copy and pasted from other states. Not only are lawmakers not asking us our opinion about how this would impact people, but it's also not constituent led. They're not even asking other constituents about how it would impact people. That doesn't keep us from showing up. So we're still going to be at subcommittees talking to legislators. Keenan Crow, our director of policy and advocacy, absolutely leads this front in coalition with lots of other organizations. And I also think it's important to mention that, part of the reason I can't give a great grade is because there are some amazing legislators that are trying to of course, make sure these bills don't get passed into law, but they are also trying to create opportunities for us to give that feedback by scheduling hearings and things like that. And so I will say that, part of kind of the overall theme for this question, at least for me, is that there are really wonderful people on the ground fighting that good fight, trying very hard to get our perspective, even if we know it might get lost in the context of legislation. When I look at public health departments, organizations that are funded by the state. There are so many incredible people in those departments that want to do the right thing and are willing to be creative to make sure we're at the table for, maybe like micro level decision making, policy development. They're going to try to find workarounds so that they can engage the LGBTQ community. So I don't often think we get to talk about that very much, but I do think that like those people, I've seen them pop up more and more and more as we've seen more hostility. I've also seen a lot of people say like, we're keeping you in this fight. We have to be creative about it, but we're here with you. That can happen at the, state legislature, but it can also happen in like a small department. So I think that that's really valuable to keep in mind. There's so many people trying to do good. But of course, when we look at the legislation overall, because we know that it's not written with constituents in mind, our opinion largely does not matter because it's not written to meet the needs of Iowans. It's written to meet the needs of a larger like legislative plan, I suppose, like nationwide. So that's something to keep in mind when you see laws like this that aren't developed here in Iowa. They come from other places. Usually our opinion does not matter to those lawmakers.
And that would be an example of, and Emily wasn't necessarily referring to that specifically, but an example of what she's talking about when you said, Emily, there's occasions when something comes forward and even if your input is sought, you kind of get the sense that the script is already written, so to speak.
Well, absolutely. And, the policy that Max is talking about absolutely impacted us because we saw a call volume increase significantly. We saw volume increase significantly from teachers and parents who were concerned, teachers in crisis, parents in crisis, teachers in crisis for themselves and for youth in their classrooms, parents in crisis. We saw an increase in our LGBTQ youth that were calling. Kind of flavor isn't the right word, but when policy like that is passed, it is very far reaching and it impacts. I mean, we're talking about the human condition. The impact is incredibly broad. And so, we sense that impact because we saw all call volume increase. We did additional trainings with our teams related to LGBTQ in an effort to really provide as much of a specific and understanding response as possible. So,
yeah. As a sort of, and I wanted to just go back real quick and Max, not a question, but just kind of ping and highlight again for listeners. I thought that was really interesting. It was interesting to hear your view of that there's still, people in places out there still trying to help, even after maybe a policy goes the other way and people still wanting to be helpful to organizations like yours. I thought that was fascinating. Thank you for sharing that. Oh yeah, please.
Before you jump to the next question,
please.
One of the themes that I want to pull out from this is this underscores just the importance of our nonprofits being engaged in the legislative process. You may not know this if you're not steeped in nonprofit work, but I call it like the biggest conspiracy theory of the nonprofit sector is that many nonprofits believe that they cannot engage with lawmakers and that they cannot advocate, they cannot lobby, they cannot engage, that it's illegal. They'll get their tax status stripped away from them. And so this is pervasive. And so why that is sad is you just think about all the topics we've talked about today that impact nonprofits, which I'd say all of them, and the people they serve. And some of these nonprofits are scared to go talk to their lawmakers about it, are scared to go to the table. And so then it just further reduces their opportunity to engage. Like Max said, One Iowa is a very sophisticated organization and has great staff and who know the laws and know the rules. And so they're able to make those relationships with people in the agencies and in the departments that are able to navigate these situations. But if you're not able to, don't believe you can make those relationships, then you're just like, I always say, I want my organizations to be at the table, not on the menu. And if they're not at the table, then they're going to be on the menu. And so many of our nonprofits are on the menu and don't even know that they can try to change the outcome of that decision.
Bethany, I appreciate you bringing that up because when I started in my role 10 years ago, I had so much anxiety about going and talking to lawmakers. I feel like it's not set up to be a really comfortable space. And so, if you don't feel comfortable going, if you don't know what you're supposed to say, if you don't know, can you advocate for a specific bill or is it just, specific issues? What does that look like? Can you call your legislator? How do you connect with them? I mean, there's so much education, and I know you guys do a lot of that, but to teach nonprofits and to increase the comfort level of going and knowing, well, when is session? How do you get someone to come out and talk to you? What does that look like? What if they don't want to talk to you? Well, then what do you do? I mean, so I really appreciate you bringing that up.
Thank you. Yes.
Yeah, I love this when this happens. I was about to go to a viewer question that basically y'all just answered. I'll ask it anyways in case you want to add to it. But this is the we're all on the same wavelength here. This was great. So the viewer question was, how do you balance the current needs with the future risk of restriction possibility? Getting at those kind of fears that you talked about, Bethany, and they say balance in terms of where do you focus your organization, or also / as a leader of the organization. So I don't know if you have any to add to that.
Well, I can say from the sector level, and I'm sure my panelists, especially Emily, can talk more. That is one of the challenges is for many organizations like behavioral health organizations or One Iowa that particularly have lots of bills coming at them. I can't remember, it's like over 40 anti-LGBTQ bills were introduced last session. That is a lot. That is a lot. And for a really small organization and for a really, large organization, that's something that we are working with the Iowa Nonprofit Alliance is that is the challenge all the time. What is on fire? What is not a risk? What is not a threat? What do we need to address right now? What can we put on the back burner? Where can we, and that's why another thing we haven't talked about that is so important in policymaking is coalitions. Where can we rely on our coalitions? Where can we rely on our coalition partners to step up when we're not able to, or maybe are better messengers? So that is a perennial challenge of nonprofit leaders specifically engaged in policy.
And I would say, there are nonprofits out there who have lobbyists that are on their payroll, that they hire a consultant. I think that we do not. Part of that is because we're involved in a coalition or an association. We pay those dues and the association or coalitions kind of help us go through those bills, and we talk as a larger group, and then there's advocacy. But that isn't necessarily how I would want to spend our agency dollars. And that doesn't mean it's not important. And so I think there's a balance there to some extent. I also think it's very hard, and it's something that I struggle with, that, we know that behavioral health changes are really important. And so there's advocacy around bills that are really critical for moving the system in what we hope and think is in the right direction. And when policy passes that impact the people we serve, that becomes really complicated from an advocacy perspective. So, I really appreciated the governor signed the new behavioral health bill in our new building, which was great. We are one of the largest crisis response providers, and that's great. And when we look at policy changes, I have a lot of employees, me included, who are very LGBTQ supportive. And so reconciling some of those things can be really complicated from a leadership perspective. And so I think looking at advocacy how do we prioritize? What does that look like? And reminding myself and reminding my team that I get to have, even as a leader, I get to have my own perspectives around policy. I get to advocate for my own perspectives around policy that can be different than what I advocate for our organization. And I encourage all of our employees to also advocate for themselves, what they care about, what do they get to do to make sure that their views are also heard as not only individuals in communities that they care about, but also as employees of our organization, knowing that policy absolutely impacts the people we serve.
That's great, and that also leads. I'm going to take another viewer question right now because it dovetails perfectly off of what you just talked about there, Emily. And thank you for the great question, folks. There's more that I'd like to try and get to, but this one says, as leaders of your respective organizations, how do you manage when frustration happens from your team, whether it's a big policy hardship or a challenge that comes up? How do you keep them focused and optimistic and on mission?
Well, I do my best to be transparent. I think that's really important. Tell them what I know, tell them when I don't know, find the answers if I can. Remind our employees what that they are important members of our family here at Foundation 2, but also important members of their community. Be a sounding board if they want that. How do we have candid conversations even when they're difficult? I think that's something that continues to go by the wayside. It's okay to disagree, and it's okay to have candid conversations if you can do that respectfully. Max, I think you were going to say something.
Well, and I was going to say, I have a sneaking suspicion that Max's group in particular was in mind when this question was asked.
Yeah. I think so a couple of things, and also to build on a point that I wanted to make about the last question.
Hmm.
One thing that's really interesting when you are in a space that is like identity based is often there is a scarcity mentality overall, right? Like One Iowa is the only person that can ever do, or organization that can ever do like LGBTQ work ever. And that's not true. It actually takes all of us that are in this space. So that's One Iowa, Iowa Safe Schools, some of our other like non-LGBTQ organizations, like, or specifically LGBTQ organizations like the ACLU, Planned Parenthood, but also the Iowa Trans Mutual Aid Fund, the Queer Youth Resource Center, all of these different organizations that make it possible for us to do the work that we do. And so that's something I wanted to just touch on because sometimes people can get worried about like when we're looking at something like prioritizing and strategizing like what we have the time and capacity for, especially when we're putting out 40 anti-LGBTQ fires during the legislative session. Sometimes it can feel like we have to do it all, but I do really think that one of the things that's really meaningful about building community in other organizations is that more is more, especially with identity-based work. There's never going to be enough liberation work in a variety of different marginalized identities in Iowa because we live in a very straight, white, like anti or like kind of ableist space in Iowa. And so I think having good conversations about how we can all fit in is very important. So that's one thing I just wanted to address when it came to making like priorities with all the things that are happening. But also if there are things that feel like priorities that we need to turn to or new systems we need to build, I'm always trying to figure out how to work with other organizations to see how we can coordinate those efforts. Because when we saw the, ban on gender affirming care for youth, that didn't mean that we opened up a new wing of our organization where we just worked on gender affirming care for youth, right? But we fortified our healthcare advocacy efforts. We sent people to the right organization. So I wanted to say that too. Sometimes in the nonprofit space, and I know Bethany is very candid about this, it can be easy to feel like you have to be the one so you can have all the dollars. And I think discernment is very important. And I think making sure that the right organizations are activated is also very important. So I wanted to mention that. But when it comes to like internal conflict, I do think it is also important to know where we do fit into that larger thing. So like, this is meant to build on that, where I know that One Iowa is an organization that is working at the Capitol. We are trying to engage a pretty broad range of people in the work that we do, which means that we're going to serve a different function than a mutual aid organization or a youth-based organization. And so knowing that, I think, is helpful when we have staff conversations about how we want to approach things, because we can be clear and discerning about what we're able to do. And I think most people are on the right page there. But I do think that when it comes to that conflict, I'm always paying attention to power dynamics. We don't have a super hierarchical organization, but at the end of the day, as the leader, I know that there's going to be candid conversations that need to be had that people are not maybe going to feel like they can have with me. And it's my job to try to navigate safety in that space. But I also think that whenever we're approaching how we're going to move forward in a space, how we're going to navigate legislation, the messaging we're going to use, I think that there's a deep sense of trust with our team. I really trust everyone on the team to help support and make a decision. And it's very rare that I would make a decision on my own with nobody's input, because that's not how I want to lead. And so I do think that that helps when it comes to conflict, because most of the time it never gets to an explosive place, because we have this open line of communication and discernment about what our mission is and how we show up in the community. So that was a very long answer to like both questions.
Yeah, no, that's all right. I appreciate that. I wanted to real quick give y'all a chance. I want to be careful that the tone of the discussion, this questions, doesn't sound completely defeatist, because I assume you have victories that have happened over time too. So maybe if any of you can think of an example, and whether that's a proactive, a policy that you sought and advocated for because you thought it was good from the start and got across the finish line, or maybe there was something coming down the pipeline that you asked for a little bit of a pumping on the brakes on, and maybe got something that either stopped it altogether or maybe lessened what you feared was going to be a negative impact on your organization. And I'll just throw the door wide open here is for any examples you all might have to that kind of example. Gosh, I hope someone has one.
Yeah, I mean, one thing I'll just say is Keenan, our director of policy and advocacy, who is just an incredible person and has been doing this work for so long. Keenan often says that so many of the successes we see we'll never be able to share with anyone, because part of the reason that they happened was because people don't know that they happened, right? Like these are that are happening behind closed doors, advocacy work. So there's a lot of good happening that you might not see, but trust in the community that it's there. But of course, Bethany mentioned all the anti-LGBTQ bills we've seen in the past couple of years, and but for a handful of them, they all did not pass. They were all, killed off by the end of the legislative session. So that's a victory. And even if it just feels like harm reduction, that's huge. And that is like very intentional work on the part of Keenan and the coalition members that we have. So I always feel a lot of gratitude, even though it can kind of feel like we're fighting a hard fight, because I see all of those things as a success. So just keep that in mind too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, one that I could easily mention is, when we look at rates of pay for our shelter for kids that are involved in the system, either in the foster care system or juvenile justice system. We have court-ordered beds at our facility, and we work diligently to raise rates. They hadn't been raised in many years, and trying to figure out what did that look like and where was that money going to come from, and working really closely with HHS and with the Coalition for Children and Families in Iowa to really make sure that we could not only articulate what rate did make sense, but also why. I think we can't go and ask for something if we can't kind of show why it's something that's really important. So that's a recent success that I could easily talk about. There's I would also say there's a lot of policy, I think, that starts out early in session that really is just bad practice. And, people don't pay attention super early in session to all of the things that are on the table. And so I completely agree with Max that often a lot of those things that just don't get pushed through, people might not even know about, but we're there advocating for best practice, for good practice, for what improves quality of life. How do we streamline our work? How do we make our work more efficient? And so just trying to, dig into some of those. And I think it's hard sometimes, back to a prior question, to be selective about where do we want to put our effort. If something is just gonna pass and we know that and there isn't anything to be done, that's not where I want to spend my time. So, where do we have impact? How do we leverage relationships we have to help policymakers really understand the impact when they don't do the work, they don't see the work in action. So
I want to go to one more viewer question here. And again, thank you to all of them. They've been great. I appreciate you participating with us in addition to listening. And a quick reminder in our last 10 minutes here, if you have a question for our panelists, put that in the chat and we'll get to them in down the home stretch here as time allows. This goes back to something, Emily, that you had said a little while back, and I'll just read you the question. When the policy impact is so far reaching as you described, how can organizations like yours share that story with lawmakers and to the larger community in a way that can be helpful, that can, share the voice of the impact that you believe that policy will have? I think essentially the question is, how do you get your message out to enough people to I guess influence, whether it's policymakers or public sentiment on something like that?
yeah, so I think we do that in a couple of ways. One of them is I spend a lot of time building relationships. How do you cultivate and maintain relationships with people who are decision makers? And so I think when there is impact, specifically, like if we're looking at anti-LGBTQ policy that impacted, the volume on the crisis line, who did I have those conversations with? Well, that is an actual, very real impact related from policy. And so, leveraging relationships to talk with, is that Director Garcia at HHS, like who are the relationships that we've spent time building so that we can have those candid conversations, so that is a safe space so they can understand the impact. I think the other thing is, we do a lot of kind of letter writing a couple ways. So we do letters to the editor or guest columns when there's issues that are where we want to articulate to a broader group, how policy has impacted the work we do. We also have, constituents that are involved and invested in our work. We have a newsletter that goes out. We're active on social media. And so I think, being able to, share that in a variety of ways. I also think we don't always know. I'm trying to think the best way to, but like, we don't always know what that impact is. So like, I feel like it's our responsibility to share that story, to share how call volume increased, but what someone else does with that, that's up to them. And so I think just making sure that we tell people, if this is policy that impacts you, here's something that you can do with it, or here's something you can do about that. I mean, I feel really, policy stuff that I feel super strong about, like safe storage of firearms. When we look at suicide rates, when we look at, what we want to call red flag laws, there's a lot of stuff around that I feel really, really compelled to speak about. And so I also think leveraging lived experience is really important. We, in the communities we live in, like society doesn't, in my opinion, society doesn't respect lived experience as much as they should, because I think when we have our own lived experience and we can articulate that and leverage that to help someone else understand, this isn't that person over there. This is me. I'm someone I'm someone you care about, and this is my experience. It really personalizes the issue in a way that, maybe has someone think about something in a different way than they would if they think, well, that's happening to people over there. That doesn't happen to anyone I know.
Yeah. I like when I talk about nonprofits engaged in advocacy, I say they have like the four superpowers of nonprofits engaged in advocacy. And one is they have access to, first of all, they're subject matter experts. So Max is a subject matter expert LGBTQ policy, Emily is in behavioral health policy. And just as a reminder, our lawmakers are not policy experts, most of them. I think that's something that the public doesn't really know, but they can't be. It's impossible to be a subject matter expert. They might be on one or two topics, but not all the topics that come ahead of them. So that's another reason why it's important for them to engage nonprofits or nonprofits to engage with them. They're subject matter experts. They have localized data that lawmakers need. They have access to people with lived expertise. And the fourth one is they have access to people who care and are motivated to act. And so part of our democratic process is getting people engaged and talking about why these are so important. And nonprofits are like perfectly suited to do that.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No, I just love what both of you have said, but Emily, your point about sharing your personal experience, I think that that's important too, because especially in the LGBTQ community, we live in a culture and a society where the default is that you're not LGBTQ, or at least that's what, the cultural norm is. I am not saying that that is correct because it's not, but when it comes to anti-LGBTQ legislation, it's very easy for people to think, I don't know an LGBTQ person. There's at this point, outdated stat that always tickles me, but at one point, more people had thought that they had seen a ghost that had met a trans person. And congratulations.
What?
Right. Everybody that is
I don't even understand, Max.
Listen, but the great thing for you all, in case you haven't before, you have now met a trans person. I'm happy to be your first one. But all of that is to say that, like, of course, being on panels like this is a great opportunity, but like one of the things we love to do in policy and advocacy work is to highlight stories. Storytelling is very important, and that's actually the bedrock of One Iowa's work. Even back when we were fighting for marriage, it was giving people the stories of marriage, giving people the stories of the kids that are going to lose care or have to leave their school or have to leave the state. And so one of the ways that you can make that more wide-reaching is that if you don't think you know a person that's LGBTQ, you definitely know a person that has an LGBTQ loved one. And if they're, needing to call crisis lines, they're not sure how to support their kids, and they have to leave the state. Even if you don't think you know anybody that's connected to an LGBTQ person, which isn't true, you probably care about the fact that we're losing workers right and left in Iowa because they have to leave because they have LGBTQ family members. And so I think like the story can permeate out. And one thing that's been beautiful to me is seeing all the people that are not LGBTQ that say, this matters to me. I love an LGBTQ person, and I'm gonna use my voice now, because again, people so often can kind of pigeonhole our voices or not listen to them. So I think that that's powerful as well, and I'm really glad you lifted that up, Emily.
Excellent. Looking at the clock, and we're down to our last few minutes. I wanted to give everybody a chance to offer any closing comments they have. If there's anything you want to sum up, or maybe something that we didn't get to in our time. And man, this hour flew. It just shows how important all this stuff is and how much we could go on and on about this. So in about 30 seconds or so, if each of you want to give a closing comment or a separate thought, and I'll just look at my screen and go right down the row and start with you, Bethany.
Well, thank you. I just want to remind everyone that we are in an election season, and the best time to educate a lawmaker is when they are a candidate. So I just want to remind folks, if there are things that you're passionate about or issues that have sparked you to talk to a lawmaker, talk to those candidates who come to your door and are calling you. Because I always say, I guarantee once they get elected, they won't be knocking on your door until the next election cycle. But just want to remind folks that the nonprofit sector is a very important sector in Iowa, and encourage you all to volunteer, engage, and follow your favorite nonprofits.
Max.
Yeah, one thing I wanted to make sure to touch on that was, part of some of the questions was how to like kind of recruit and retain folks. And
Mhm.
I wanted to touch on this because obviously our team is up against a lot. Our jobs are really, really hard and we're a tiny team. So one thing I did want to just say is like if you are in the same boat, I highly recommend like paying attention to employee benefits, looking at a 32-hour work week, allowing people to have work-life balance. Taking care of your people is really, really important, no matter, what the fight you are fighting is. So I wanted to make sure to say that because I don't know that it's often talked about, and I'm very passionate about it.
Yeah, that's one. Workforce is one I was hoping to get to. So thank you for that, Max. And Emily, take us home.
Well, I absolutely had workforce stuff on my list to talk about too, but caring for employees is great. The one thing that I think I would mention is that, you know, often policy impacts people. These are human lives. This is quality of life issues, and you can trickle any policy down to impacting someone that you care about. And I just think if anyone has uh, personal issues, things that they want to talk about, even instill curiosity, dig into those policies, look at them, see how they impact people, advocate for what you care about, and remember that these are people's lives.
All right. Thank you so much to all of you on the panel that joined us for this terrific discussion. I sincerely appreciate it. We couldn't do something like this without you. Thank you to everybody who tuned in and listened very much. And again, thank you to our track sponsor, Tanager. Iowa Ideas goes on. The next round of sessions begins at 1:55. Head to iowaideas.com, look at schedule, find another one, and join us for more great discussions like this one. Thank you, everybody, for joining us.